So hello, everybody. Let me greet you once again, and thank you for being there. This is the fourth session of the PWL International Seminar, and also the last one this academic year. As you know, this seminar is hosted by IFILNOVA in the context of the FCT funded project, Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, an Ancient Model, a Contemporary Approach. And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce you to Lucas Nascimento Machado, our speaker today. Dr. Lucas Machado is a substitute professor of history of philosophy at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and he's also current director of the Latin American Network of Intercultural Philosophy, ALAPHI. He's the author of the book Hegel and the Relationship Between Skepticism and Philosophy, published by Editora Dialéctica in 2022, and he's also one of the translators of Byung-Chul Han's work to Portuguese, having also translated works of other modern and contemporary philosophers such as Hegel, Fichte, Marcus Gabriel, and Dieter Emmerich. He has published several articles and given talks on German idealism, philosophy of mind, ancient philosophy, both Greek and Indian, intercultural philosophy, Byung-Chul Han's philosophy, PWL, and other things. The title of his talk today is Life Beyond Capitalism, an attempt at an interlocution between Hadot, Foucault, and Byung-Chul Han. So we are really looking forward to listen to your talk, Lucas. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marta, for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here with everyone, with all the people who I have already met from the other seminars and from the Congress in December. It's I'm really honored and, to be honest, quite nervous to be here right now, but I'll try my best to give an interesting presentation. And first of all, I'll share my slides here. Let's see if you guys can see it. Can everyone see the slides here? Yeah? Yes. Okay, good. So, first of all, I thought I would start with a joke, which is also kind of an honest question, which is, what am I doing here? I mean, in a sense, obviously, I'm not a specialist on PWL. I don't have anything published on that topic. And I thought, because of that, it would be interesting to let you guys know how I came to the subject and from what point of view I'm talking about this project, about this perspective of PWL. So, although I did my master's and my PhD on German idealism with focus on Hegel, I've been studying also parallel to this research for quite a while, intercultural philosophy, so to speak, non-European traditions, and I have been very interested in that already for quite a few years. And the more I studied about it, the more it seemed to me that Hadot's concept of spiritual exercises allowed for an approximation between the so-called Western traditions of philosophy and non-European traditions. So at some point in 2020, I started reading the spiritual exercises and the book Spiritual Exercises, and even giving a course on it. And coincidentally, in 2021, I became substitute professor in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which means I give classes philosophy itself, but rather to social sciences, history, and so on. And I thought, well, that might be an interesting introduction to philosophy to people from outside philosophy. And I decided to give them What is Ancient Philosophy? The book from Hadot, of course. And I've been giving this course based on what is ancient philosophy now already for 2 years. And the more I read it, the more I saw how Hadot's perspective, as it's presented there, aligns with my own perspective on philosophy in many ways. And I began to, develop a very specific perspective on what Hadot is saying there and how it connects to contemporary issues in philosophy, particularly, of course, with this debate around Foucault and Byung-Chul Han and Byung-Chul Han's philosophy. And also so I wanted to show what kind of perspective came to me about philosophy as a way of life based on those 2 years that have been given the what is ancient philosophy in my courses in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and how this connects to these contemporary issues. But another thing that I have to say, though, is that since, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be there for the Congress in July, I really wanted to use the opportunity of the seminar to present then in a more broader perspective, what is my take on PWL, what I think are some of the main ideas we have to have in mind in order to understand Hadot's approach, which is the one I'm going to be focused here. And this means that, in a way, another meme that we could put here would be this one, the one from Netflix, you know, oh, I lied. I said we were going on a date, but you're actually going to study Marx or whatever. So in a sense, one can say that I lied. I said we were going to focus on, you know, Byung-Chul Han and Foucault, but I'm really going to focus more on my perspective, first on my take on PWL, and then by the end of the presentation, make this connection with Foucault, Byung-Chul Han, try to show how I think this discussion is relevant to this contemporary debate on alternative forms of life beyond capitalism. So, first of all, then, when we are talking about philosophy as a way of life, in a very general definition, we could understand this as meaning that philosophy is not philosophical discourse, but rather a way of life. But of course, we have to ask, what does that mean exactly? And I think that Hadot gives a very significant indication of that in the introduction of the What is Ancient Philosophy, where he says, look, usually the way philosophy is taught at universities presents philosophy as something that is focused on the construction of systems, of philosophical systems of thought, of discourse. And first, you have this system construction, this articulation of a philosophical discourse, and then only after that, you might wonder what are the moral or the practical implications of that discourse. But first of all, you have to have the theory or the discourse, and then you try to extract from it practical consequences. But this is secondary and accessory. It's not what defines philosophical discourse as such, that you have to drive to extract practical consequences to your life in a way, because philosophy is focused on this system building. So in a way, discourse comes first, and then the implications to one's life come second. But what Hadot is saying here in the introduction is that for ancient philosophers, it was rather the other way around. Life comes first, a way of life comes first, which is the philosophical way of life, which then leads philosophers to try to translate, to express, and even to practice this philosophical way of life somehow by means of discourse, using discourse, but as a result of adopting a certain way of life. So in that sense, it's also important to note that to say that philosophy that has a way of life is not philosophical discourse does not mean to say that it excludes philosophical discourse from it, but rather that what identifies philosophy, what is the definition of philosophy, is the way one lives. And philosophical discourse might be included on that, or rather discourse might be included in this way of life, but it is only philosophical insofar as it is connected to a philosophical way of life. So as I'm saying here, this means that it's not the discourse that defines whether a way of life is philosophical, but rather the other way around. It's the connection of a discourse to a philosophical way of life that makes it philosophical. I think it's important to note that because we have had a couple of discussions already on this in this Congress in December, where at some point there was some idea that we could classify different philosophies as more or less philosophical according to the degree to which they adopted a more or less rational discourse. And I don't think this is the perspective Hadot is offering here, because again, it's not the rationality of a discourse that makes a way of life philosophical, but rather is the fact that as a discourse is connected to a specific philosophical way of life that makes this discourse philosophical. And again, this does not mean that philosophy excludes this discourse. It just means that it's not identical to philosophical discourse. And this is also relevant when we are trying to pin down or what we understand as essential to our conception of PWL, because in Matthew's talk, I wasn't present there, but I saw the recording later. In Matthew's talk, there was also this discussion that, well, there are people that say, well, true philosophy, any philosophy that is worth its name has some sort of implication in our life. So this would entail that any true philosophy is ultimately philosophy as a way of life. And I think it's a mistake to make this jump, because it's one thing to say that philosophy has implications in one's life. It's another thing to say that philosophy is itself a way of life. Because of course, the profession we have has impact on the way we live, the kinds of activities we do professionally or technically, but that does not mean that those professions are to be identified with our lives as such. And this is also true of philosophy as a profession. Of course, the fact that we adopt philosophy as an academic profession has implications to our lives, implies that we somehow, that this changes aspects of our living, but that does not mean that philosophy then is the way we live as such, something that permeates or the whole of our living, the whole way in which we live. And this has the very way we lead our lives on a daily basis. So, but then one could ask, because of course there is this difficulty, if philosophy is not to be identified with a kind of discourse, but rather with a way of life, which kinds of ways of way of life are philosophical? What makes a way of life philosophical is, if not the fact that it's tied to a rational discourse, so to speak. What are the characteristics of a philosophical way of life? And whether people agree with the presentation I'm giving here or not is less relevant, but I truly believe that it's very important for the discussion on PWL and what defines PWL, that we take seriously the discussion not only of the concept of philosophy, but of Sophia, of wisdom itself. Hadot is not only proposing a different way of understanding the term philosophy. By doing that, he's also explicitly proposing another way to understand the term Sophia, wisdom, because only by understanding how wisdom is to be understood here, that we can define philosophy as the search for that kind of wisdom. And precisely, when Hadot tries to offer some sort of conception, when he first, in what is ancient philosophy, approaches the concept of Sophia and tries to, or rather the term Sophia, and tries to provide us with an understanding of it, he then presents this definition, so to speak, which I think is one of the most important passages of the book, because it clearly points to this main characteristic of Sophia, in that understanding, in that specific understanding, which is, has highlighted here. In the last analysis, real knowledge is know-how, and true know-how is knowing how to do good. And somehow to express or to present what is meant here as this sort of know-how, I think there is a very significant text from Schwanzi. And I think I'm authorized here to use a Chinese philosopher because Hadot himself often quotes Chinese philosophers in What is Ancient Philosophy, and even Schwanzi himself, I think. Not this particular text, but I think this is very elucidative of this conception of wisdom as know-how. And then in this passage, then Schwanzi speaks from the perspective of a wheelwright, and he says, I look at it from the point of view of my work. When I chisel a wheel, if the blows of the mallet are too gentle, the chisel slides and won't take hold. But if they are too hard, it bites in and won't budge. Not too gentle, not too hard. You can get it in your hand and feel it in your mind. You can't put it into words, and yet there's a knack to it somehow. I can't teach it to my son, and he can't learn it from me. So I have gone along for 70 years at my age, and at my age, I'm still chiseling wheels. When the men of old died, they took with them the things that couldn't be handed down. So what you are reading there must be nothing but the chaff and dregs of the men of old. That means this sort of wisdom is something that ultimately can't be fully expressed by discursive thought, or can't be ultimately expressed discursively. So, and it's very interesting how this passage here connects to the symposium where Socrates talks to Agathon, and he says, oh, it would be good, Agathon, if wisdom was such that it could be passed from one vessel to another, or something in that sense, where he means that he cannot really tell Agathon what he learned, because it's not something that can be expressed purely as some sort of discourse. So, and again, it's important to note the fact that this sort of wisdom can't ultimately be expressed discursively doesn't mean that discourse is then entirely discarded. Rather, it means that it plays a specific role in contributing to reaching that sort of wisdom, where philosophical discourse is meant to point out and to bring you to a certain state of being, rather than being fully successful in describing what this state of being is as such. So, but what does it mean to know how to do good then here, according to this definition of Sophia? Well, if ultimate wisdom is knowing how to do good, from a PWL point of view, knowing how to do good, one could say, is knowing how to live well. But to live well here means very specifically to reach this perfect peace of mind, imperturbability, ataraxia. To live well is to reach serenity, as the highest form of happiness one can achieve. So one could say that true wisdom is perfection of being, a state of plenitude, which translates experientially as serenity and peace of mind. I know this might be a rather polemic thesis, but I'll bring a quote from Hadot later to show that at least on What is Ancient Philosophy, there are good reasons to believe that this is the sort of wisdom that Hadot advocates for there. In particular here, of course, he says, at first glance, in fact, one might wonder if the conceptions of wisdom were really all that different among the schools. All Hellenistic schools seem to define it in approximately the same terms. First and foremost, as a state of perfect peace of mind. Whether or not they lay claim to the Socratic heritage, all Hellenistic philosophers agreed with Socrates that human beings are plunged in misery, anguish, and evil because they exist in ignorance. Evil is to be found not within things, but in the value judgments which people bring to bear upon things. People can therefore be cured of their ills only if they are persuaded to change their value judgments. And in this sense, all these philosophies wanted to be therapeutic. In order to change our value judgments, however, we must make a radical choice to change our entire way of thinking and way of being. This choice is the choice of philosophy, and it's thanks to it that we may obtain inner tranquility and peace of mind. So again, the focus here, the idea is that wisdom is this state of inner tranquility, of peace of mind. It's not to be described in terms of some sort of discursive knowledge that one can accumulate, but rather has a way of being that is just fine. It has this state of perfection, of plenitude, of tranquility that is reached by this plenitude. But then the question can be made of how should one try to reach wisdom then, understood as peace of mind? How can we get there? And of course, Hadot's answer to that is by means of spiritual exercises. And here again, we encounter the philosophical discourse as having a fundamental role, but not as an end into itself, but as one of the core spiritual exercises that philosophy practices. So he then says here, I think this is a very important passage where he delineates the three ways, the three main ways in which philosophical discourse is connected to philosophical life. First, has a way of justifying this choice of life and developing all its implications. Second, in order to transmit this philosophical way of life to other people. And lastly, has one of the very ways through which one practices this way of life. And here it's important to say this means a very specific idea of how the discourse is part of a spiritual exercise. This does not mean that some purely theoretical approach already suffices for a philosophical discourse to be connected to be a spiritual exercise. The most clear example here would be Socrates, because of course Socrates' way of life is inseparable from the use he made of the discourse. But the use he made, of course, in many ways wasn't of system building, wasn't of building a discourse, a theory, but rather was questioning people in order to bring them into some sort of self-consciousness, into consciousness of their own ignorance, of their own lack of knowledge, and so on. So the way he uses discourse is not meant to focus on its descriptive aspect, to provide a theory of what is good or of what is just, for instance, but rather to bring about this effect on his interlocutors of making them self-aware, aware of their own selves. So in this way, philosophical discourse is used as a spiritual exercise, because it's not an end into itself, but rather what matters here is the sort of effect it produces into the one who listens to this discourse, but also the one who uses it. Because Socrates himself also cultivates this sort of self-consciousness by talking to others through dialogue. So, but then again, we can make another question, which would be here: what kind of transformation do these sorts of spiritual exercises provide? What do they bring about? What is the effect that they aim at providing? And according to Hadot, in chapter 9 of What is Ancient Philosophy, and by the way, I honestly think that this chapter is perhaps the most important chapter of the book, because there he puts very clearly the more general aspects of his conception of philosophy as a way of life, of spiritual exercises, of wisdom, and so on. And there he puts out those two primary types of spiritual exercises, which are relation to the self and concentration on the I, and relation to the cosmos and the expansion of the I. So the spiritual exercises of relation to the self and concentration on the I They are aimed at making the individual focus entirely on the present moment, on who he is and what he is living right now. And what is important here is to see how Hadot uses this to illustrate the point of saying, look, different schools have different philosophical discourses, such as Epicureanism or Stoicism. But ultimately, one can see that those discourses are meant as tools, as exercises that aim at bringing you to a certain state of mind. And this particular state of mind is a common goal of those different schools. The difference between them lies in what means they use to reach those states themselves, and not in the kind of state they are looking for. So Epicureanism is going to use different sorts of arguments to say why you should focus on the present, because you only have this life, there's no life after death, and so on and so forth. And so this means you should focus on the present moment. The Stoicism, of course, is going to have different sorts of arguments and meditations on that topic, to say that, you know, since providence, everything, you don't control the results of your actions, and all that is in your control is your intention. You have to focus at every moment only in the present, which is where you can control your intentions, the intentions of how you act. But even through different arguments, the result is ultimately the same, in the sense that those arguments are meant to make you fully aware of the present moment. And then the types of spiritual exercises of relation to the cosmos and expansion of the I, which are then exercises aimed at making the individual aware of his belonging to something far greater than himself, of his connection to the whole, where his real I is to be found, where what he truly is to be found. So here, of course, we are talking about cosmic consciousness. And so the purpose of this sort of spiritual exercise is to affect cosmic consciousness as this consciousness of what one is that goes beyond individual existence, is to be conscious of my own self as something greater than what I am as an individual, as being part of a greater whole. Is then to overcome this limited consciousness of myself as only an individual separated from the whole. And again, different schools are going to have different approaches to that. Plato and, you know, the connection to the world of forms and how your soul is connected to it, or Stoicism and the fact that you are part of this cosmic organism, this whole that is the logos, and the cosmic organism, the cosmic being, and so on. But again, even if you have different ways to bring about this sort of experience, this sort of way to being conscious of oneself, the ultimate aim is to bring about this feeling, so to speak, or this experience of being aware of yourself as something that is bigger, that is larger, that goes beyond what I am as an individual, has been connected to everything. And then I think there is a very important point to be stressed here. And again, because of all of that, wisdom. Oh wait, there's a. Okay, I'm going to see your question later, Paulo. Then I can answer it. But then, wisdom here is reached by spiritual exercises precisely because it's a state of being. It's not merely knowing about something that you can express discursively. Wisdom is this know-how to live well that can only be achieved by being in a certain way. But I think it's important to stress that this conception of wisdom as a state of being does not exclude knowledge, in the sense that you could say, no, it's not about knowing, it's simply about being. Don't think about it or whatever, just be. That is not, I think, the perspective that Hadot is offering here, but rather on the contrary, for those ancient forms of philosophy, the most true form of knowledge is that in which knowing and being what is known is inseparable. in order to know something, you have to become that very something you are aiming at knowing. You have to become similar. This whole idea of participation and so on, the very idea that you only truly understand something when it becomes a part of you. It becomes a part of your own nature. So this idea of knowledge has contemplation. Again, I know this might be a very polemic part of my talk that we could discuss later on, but I believe in several passages on what is ancient philosophy, Hadot puts very clearly this idea that knowledge, in order to reach this sort of knowledge, you have to change yourself because you have to become similar to that what you want to know, this perfection of being, for instance. Or, you know, if you are going in the context of Plato, if you are going to know the ideas, you have to purify your soul, because only then it will be similar to those very ideas and you will be able to reach them and so on. So it's this very idea that to know, to truly know, is to be inseparable from that which you are knowing, that which you know. And in that context, philosophical discourse is then a tool, ever provisory and adaptable, to produce the effect of coming closer to the state of being, which is also a state of knowledge that is ultimately beyond any discursive expression. Discourse is supposed to take you to that state, but not to be an adequate and even less so a definitive expression of it. I know, again, this might be very polemic, but again, even if it's polemic, I think Hadot is making that point on several moments in what is ancient philosophy. One particularly significant moment is when he's talking about Aristotle, and there he talks about the limits of language in Aristotle himself, where he says, look, language talks about what is composite, but the divine intellect is not composite. So in order to know it, you can know it through means of language. You have to become similar to it. You have to become similar to pure thought. And that is contemplation. And that is beyond what can be expressed by discursive thought, by discourse in general. And in Socrates, in the case of Socrates himself, this appears very clearly, of course, this idea of wisdom that is a knowledge of values that can't really be expressed in any definite description of what is true, what is just, and so on. It's just to know the value of living in a certain way, of living in the philosophical way that is even worth dying for. When he talks about Plato, he brings, of course, the seventh letter, the letter 7, where Plato says that his philosophy, what it was his true philosophy, that which he always truly aimed for, was never written anywhere, was never left to be written anywhere. So there are different moments in which Hadot stresses this idea that this state, although one can use discourse as a spiritual exercise to help you reach this point, cannot be fully and adequately expressed discursively. So, of course, in order to understand that, we also have to have in mind how Hadot here is influenced by Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, of course, in that sense, in this perspective, not only of the Wittgenstein of the investigations, but also of the Tractatus, in the sense in which Wittgenstein there makes the point that language the uses of language go beyond its descriptive use. It's not only the descriptive use that one can make of language. Rather, there's a more primary and even more fundamental use of language, which is this indicative use, where it points out to something that, even if that something cannot be described within language itself. And of course, the paradigmatic example here is language itself. Language itself cannot be expressed within language. I can only show you it by using it. So there's this so I think what's at stake here is this idea that philosophical discourse is then meant not to fully describe what the sort of knowledge it aims at reaching, but rather to point to that sort of knowledge and to bring about the effect of bringing you closer to the state of knowledge, this state of mind, which is a state of peace of mind, of full peace of mind. And again, this might sound, I don't know, maybe with this emphasis on peace of mind, this might sound for some maybe a little too much Buddhist, but it's interesting to note that Hadot himself finishes chapter 9, where he's making this exposition on spiritual exercises, with a comparison with Buddhism. So it indeed tends to go that way. And then to use what time I have left to finally make this connection between Hadot, Foucault, and Byung-Chul Han. And again, because I ended focusing here on presenting my take on PWL, I only made a very brief sketch of this comparison. So of course, I'm probably not going to be really fair to Foucault and to his conception of the notion of the self, of the care of the self. I'm focusing here more on the sort of critique that Hadot makes to Foucault to see how the kind of dialogue we have here and how this connects to this perspective on PWL that I presented here. But anyway, according to Hadot, then Foucault's notion of care of the self it omits the fact that ancient philosophy is not actually concerned with cultivating the individual, right? But rather with overcoming it. The point is not to cultivate an individual existence in the terms of an aesthetics of existence, but rather to overcome my condition as an individual, to be connected to something larger. And of course, here we are talking about cosmic consciousness. And in particular, in the book Spiritual Exercises, where he talks about this interrupted dialogue with Foucault, I only have here the translation in Portuguese, so I'm going to attempt to make a translation into English. Hadot says himself, that is why instead of talking of culture of the self, it would be better to talk about transformation, transfiguration, overcoming of the self. To describe this state, it's not possible to avoid the term wisdom, which it seems occurs only seldom, maybe never in Foucault. Wisdom is the state to which the philosopher maybe will never reach, but to which he tends to, striving to transform himself in order to overcome himself. It's a mode of existence. So here, wisdom has a mode of existence, has a mode of being, characterized by three essential aspects: the peace of mind, ataraxia, the interior freedom, autarkeia, and, except for the skeptics, which I find debatable, but that's another point, the cosmic consciousness, that is, taking consciousness of your belonging to the whole. So here Hadot says precisely that Foucault's notion of the care of the self focuses too much on this idea of the individual self and of the individual existence, when philosophy has the love for wisdom would be the love for this state of being which leads me beyond my consciousness, my existence merely as an individual. And I think we could further point out, this is a point that Hadot himself doesn't stress, but I think it's an interesting point to be explored. And again, I'm here talking about this only very briefly, but I think it's a point worth developing further in other opportunities. I think one of the reasons why the dimension of cosmic consciousness is not present in Foucault's conception of the care of the self is precisely because he makes this distinction between care and knowledge, and he ends up giving priority to the care of the self rather than the knowledge of the self, as it seems to be the case in this passage here of the hermeneutics of the subject, in which he says, in some texts to which we'll have to return, there is rather a kind of subordination of the expression of the rule, know yourself, to the precept of care of the self. I'm really sorry for my Greek here, gnoti selton, know yourself, appears quite clearly and again in a number of significant texts within the more general framework of the epimeleia helton. Care of oneself has one of the forms, one of the consequences, has a sort of concrete, precise, and particular application of a general rule. You must attend to yourself. You must not forget yourself. You must take care of yourself. The rule, know yourself, appears and is formulated within and at the forefront of this care. So again, even though this conception presupposes that there is a connection between the care of the self and the knowledge of the self, it also establishes a sort of distinction between both that I don't think that hold from a Hadotian perspective, because from that perspective, there just doesn't seem to be any sense in separating the two, because knowledge has knowledge of the universal, has this knowledge of this universal truth, isn't discursive knowledge, as Foucault seems to assume here, but rather is this cosmic consciousness experimented in my own self as my true self. So there is no opposition between cultivating myself and knowing the universal, because cultivating myself is overcoming myself. So this even remembers this phrase from Dogen, a very famous phrase from Dogen, this Zen Buddhist philosopher, where he says, to know oneself is to forget oneself. It's something very much along these lines that is present here. But okay, then one could ask, but why does that matter? Why is that distinction between Foucault's notion of the care of the self and Hadot's perspective on philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as a spiritual exercises? Why would that be relevant for us today from the perspective of the issues we face today as a society and so on? And here is where I think the connection with Byung-Chul Han becomes relevant, because within the context of analyzing the ways that neoliberalism today develops new technologies of power by means of which it submits individuals to this imperative of production, he says then, in fact, the blind spot in Foucault's analysis is the technology of power under the neoliberal regime. Foucault did not see that the neoliberal regime utterly claims the technology of the self for its own purposes. Perpetual self-optimization has the exemplary neoliberal technology of the self, represents nothing so much as a highly efficient mode of domination and exploitation. As an entrepreneur of himself, the neoliberal achievement subject engages into auto-exploitation willingly and even passionately. The self as a work of art amounts to a beautiful but deceptive illusion that the neoliberal regime maintains in order to exhaust its resources entirely. Again, some might say that this is not a fair critique to Foucault, because the care of the self involves other things, also care of the others, and so on. But I think there's an interesting point to be made here, that the fact that the care of the self focuses on the dimension of individual existence and excludes this perspective of cosmic consciousness can contribute to the way that it can ultimately be utilized by those sorts of power, by these sorts of neoliberal power to further their agenda in the sense of encouraging the individual to become an entrepreneur of himself. But finally, and most interestingly, beyond whether this is a fair critique to Foucault or not, I think it's interesting to see that even though apparently Byung-Chul Han never read Hadot and he never quotes Hadot explicitly at any moment in his books, the way he describes what would be an alternative life form to capitalism stress stresses a sort of relationship to the other, to someone beyond my own self, that are very reminiscent of Hadot's idea of cosmic consciousness. So in books like Philosophy of Zen Buddhism and more recently Vita Contemplativa, and the name itself suggests a strongly connection here, emphasizes this idea that to live in terms of the affability of Freundlichkeit, as this core concept by means of which this other way of life is described, is to live fully in the present, donating your consciousness entirely to the other, to that which goes beyond your individual existence. And that is what truly means to be free. He emphasizes also in Psychopolitics, but in other books, constantly this idea that the root of the word freedom and of the word friendship in German, they share a common root, which suggests that to be free is to be among friends. Freedom is always relational. It's always having this connection with something beyond your own self. If you isolate yourself and cultivate your freedom as a characteristic of your individual self, then you are already not truly free, because to reach freedom is to be connected with the other in such a way that brings what Hadot describes as a state of serenity, of indifference. He even plays with the word in dash difference, is to be indifferent among the different, among that which is different from you. And he uses the term Gelassenheit to say serenity to describe what that state would be. Again, my time is already nearly at the end. I could bring there are several quotes that could be brought in that context. I think that I'll have to leave that to another opportunity, but it's very significant how in different passages across across many of Byung-Chul Han's books, there appear different perspectives or different descriptions of what this affability would be that are very reminiscent of the spiritual exercises, in the sense of seeming to be focused both on the concentration of on the I and on being fully aware of the present moment, but also to bring about this consciousness of our connection to something beyond ourselves, whether it be nature or the world itself. In Philosophy of Zen Buddhism, it's very interesting. Hadot says that Zen Buddhism is a world religion in a very specific sense, because it's a religion of the world. It's a religion that is world affirming. It's about being entirely in the world in such a way that there is no separation between my I and the world. I am entirely within it. I am fully, I fully identify myself with the whole world and with everything. So here, this idea of cosmic consciousness really comes to the foreground. So to conclude, I would argue then that a rigorous assessment of the significance of PWL to metaphilosophy and to the history of philosophy is relevant, of course, not only due to its exegetical or academical relevance, but also not even due to its more broader relevance to the ways humans lead their lives from a general perspective. I think this discussion about PWL addresses truly some of the main problems that we face today in our society in terms of the modes of subjectivity we're molded into, and of the alternatives we need to find them today. And I think the very fact that a philosopher such as Byung-Chul Han, that is being widely discussed in terms of his critique of our society today, the very fact that he seems to be deeply connected with this PWL perspective on what would be a truly fulfilling way of life should be an indicative of this relevance of assessing the meaning and significance of PWL. And this is interesting because this actuality of PWL can be seen not only in connection with philosophers of European tradition, but also non-European indigenous traditions, such as Ailton Krenak, this indigenous Brazilian philosopher, who has a book, for instance, which is called "Life is Not Useful," in which in many of the passages of the book, the way he describes the way that the Krenak people see the connection with nature, again, are very reminiscent of this idea of cosmic consciousness. So I think there is a lot to be explored there in terms of the possibilities of thinking life beyond capitalism, so to speak. So I think that's my time. Thank you so much for your attention. Sorry for the messy presentation, and I hope we can have a fruitful discussion now.
Many, many thanks, Lucas, for this very interesting and illuminating talk. It was not messy at all. I think it was extremely clear. You gave us lots of food for thought and touched also many controversial points. And I think we'll have a beautiful discussion now. I see Pablo already wants to intervene. And then Elder, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Marta, and yes, Lucas, for a very stimulating talk. So my question is really about the first thing that you addressed, the status of discourse as opposed to, I suppose, yeah, existential life. And you made a comparison with Zhuangzi and also with Zen Buddhism, and I think these are very, very valid comparisons and make a lot of sense. I've made them myself a couple of times, and one time I had a very adept person who had been practicing Zen Buddhism for 10 years, and he vehemently disagreed with this idea that Zen Buddhism can be seen as a philosophy similar to ancient philosophy, basically. So in a Hadotian sense, consisting of life and discourse, because he said no. So in Zen Buddhism, there is no discourse. It's just life. It's just existential, the existential dimension. And well, I think you could argue that the sutras and other like literature that you refer to can count as a peculiar kind of discourse, but yeah, I'm just curious, how would you kind of explain the status of discourse in these Eastern philosophies, or as you also said, religions? There's kind of a difference between philosophy as a way of life and religion as well. But yeah, my question is about discourse, the status of discourse. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pablo. I definitely agree with you that I do think that there's a very fundamental dimension of discursivity here in Zen Buddhism. I think, and one have to keep in mind, I find it very amusing and very problematic the way that sometimes people want to act as representatives of a whole tradition when this tradition itself is multiple. There are many different approaches, many different schools, even within Zen Buddhism. So this is something we have to be wary of. But yeah, I mean, the fact itself that you have an extensive number of koans should suggest that discourse plays some kind of important role here. And again, I think it's essential in a way to understand the way Hadot thinks of the connection between way of life and discourse, to bring back his study of Wittgenstein. This is the core point. The point is, it's not about discarding philosophical discourse. It's about taking off the emphasis on the descriptive function of discourse and using discourse in a different way, not to describe something, but rather to point to something that is beyond it. And that is precisely the sort of use of the language that it seems to me that the koans and other sutras from Zen Buddhism aim to do. Of course, they say things that seem like nonsense, but precisely because they are trying to point to something that is beyond what can be described. But
okay,
this is a use of discourse. Yeah, sure.
Can I just one very brief follow-up question, because I think this is crucial. So Hadot, he says the discourse serves to rationally justify the way of life. And now the difference I would point to between a koan, for instance, and Plato's dialogues, is that a koan has almost no rational dimension. So the whole aspect of rationality seems to be absent. But yeah, what do you think?
I think that brings another very important discussion to the fore, which is, and this would be a very important point for me in terms of PWL. I mean, if we are going to reassess the history of philosophy in terms of PWL, we have to reassess not only our understanding of philosophy and not only our understanding of wisdom or knowledge. We have to reassess our understanding of reason, because reason means something entirely different here, which is not opposed to intuition, which is not opposed to experiencing. Quite on the contrary, because reason is that which shows you things as they are, and you only see things as they are in their ultimate form if you go beyond discourse. And this is not opposed to the very idea of logos, because again, from a very Wittgensteinian point of view, we can say, yes, it's logos, but logos is precisely what is beyond descriptive, a descriptive use of discourse. Logos can only be intuited directly. So in that sense, but of course, I mean that in the context of ancient Greek philosophy. In the case of Zen Buddhism, I would argue, yes, I think the discourse is a sort of justification here, but not in the sense of providing a series of, a syllogistic sort of argument or an inference. No, it's because by means of the discourse, you can justify your perspective by showing in what it's grounded, in what sort of experience it's grounded. Yeah? And I think one of the most significant images one can use to understand this way of using discourse is in Buddhism itself, in that this often used image of when Buddha points to the moon, you don't look at his finger, you look at the goddamn moon, right? It's so this is the whole point. This is the whole point of the way that discourse is being conceived here. And this is true, at least from the Hadotian perspective, of all these philosophical traditions, even the dogmatic ones, even Epicureanism and Stoicism, because even if they are saying, look, we can express something true, the point is not to express, but to live it. It's this whole distinction between philosophy as a discourse separated into three disciplines, and living philosophy has an organic whole in which you can separate ethics from logic from physics. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer to that.
Thank you, Elder.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you very much, Lucas, for this stimulating presentation. You were very meticulous in the way you followed Hadot's discussion. And it was very good to bring many of these aspects to mind. I was also very pleased with what you said now in the discussion about reason and the need to revise this concept. I fully agree with you. So I found very interesting that you placed so much emphasis on the notion of wisdom and followed the different indications that Hadot gives about this concept. But I was wondering, what do you make of of some other aspects that he also considers, namely the fact that philosophia is not simply Sophia, but is precisely this philia for Sophia as something that is absent. So he sometimes refers to Plato's canonical text, where he develops this distinction that is often also attributed to Pythagoras. And he's sometimes, I concede, not always, but sometimes he also applies it to the whole of ancient philosophy as being philosophy in the sense of a pursuit for something that is unattainable or inaccessible. In the book on what is ancient philosophy, he also describes Sophia as the transcendent norm, which I at least interpret also in the sense that it is not fully achieved, attained. So, and I think this is relevant or might be relevant because it prevents us from describing philosophy as a way of life simply by using the description of Sophia and what it involves, this tranquility, cosmic consciousness, because if the emphasis is placed in the distance that there is between us and Sophia and how we feel that distance, or we are already related to it and intention towards it, but it still is absent and not fully accessible, I wonder if this changes in some way the understanding of philosophy as a way of life, and if it brings difficulties. For instance, if we do not fully have Sophia, it might not be clear which way of life we should live if we want to be philosophical. And so this places a problem if we can be truly philosophical, or if being philosophical here is something more of a longing for something that is absent and that would have to transform itself, if philosophy as a way of life is a provisional or transitory state or transitive state. And especially it raises the question of whether philosophy is something that must always take place in philosophical discourse, if, for instance, we assume that philosophical discourse is the way of pursuing wisdom or a privileged means of pursuing wisdom. And this would mean that even if wisdom is not fully reduced to discourse or not essentially about discourse, perhaps philosophia as the pursuit of wisdom could be essentially about philosophical discourse, or something that takes place essentially in philosophical discourse, even admitting, of course, that it implies a certain modality of relation to philosophical discourse, but it would be at the core of it in a way that it is perhaps not at the core of Sophia. And I'm thinking in this Platonic tradition also, in the sense that perhaps the ultimate moment of activity, a philosophical activity, would be this insight into the truth, something intuitive. But before you reach that, you have to go through logos, through dialectics. And so that could perhaps be our position as philosophers that are not sages.
Yeah. Thank you, Elder, so much. Those are all very important points. Thank you so much for bringing this discussion. I just want to say, I was going to say the name of the indigenous Brazilian philosopher, but someone already pointed it out. Pedro pointed it out here, so great. So yeah, I fully agree with you that Hadot puts the emphasis on philosophy has, the love of wisdom, the search for wisdom, which is not reaching that state. But I think it's important to know that this doesn't mean that philosophy isn't a way of being. And at least from Hadot's perspective, he emphasizes it explicitly. It's about the way you live, not the discourse taken into itself. So first of all, I think there are more complicated aspects of the discussion, but first of all, just to say that even if it's true that philosophy doesn't correspond to wisdom, it corresponds to a state of being. And this state of being is not identical merely to discursive practices on their own. The discursive practices are meant to put you in this philosophical way of being that is to look for wisdom, which is the paradigmatic case here, of course, is Socrates. Because you see, of course, he makes a use of the discourse, but it's not to give you any descriptive definition of any definitive descriptive definition of what good is, of what just is, but to put you in the philosophical way of life, which is this constant search for wisdom by means of dialogue. But this precisely is something that can never fully be expressed in terms of discourse. So even the philosophical way of life, even the philosophical state of being itself, is already something that is beyond mere discourse, and that if the philosophical discourse is meant to bring about, not to be identical to. So even within that, I think we already have this aspect sorted out in a way. But I think things are a lot more complicated if we think in the figure of Socrates. I think you are right that there's an interesting paradox here, because you see the way that Hadot describes Plato's Symposium on chapter 4 of What is Ancient Philosophy has been actually about portraying who Socrates is, puts us in this paradox that Socrates claims that he is not wise because he does not know, but he lives as a wise person would. The way he lived, by searching for wisdom, he becomes similar to wise person itself, because the way he searches imperturbably wisdom makes him, how can you say that? It makes him, it makes it so that he's not affected by anything exterior to the search. In all situations, Socrates behaves exactly the same. It doesn't matter if he's in the symposium or if he's going to a war, nothing affects him. He is imperturbable. So paradoxically, by searching for this wisdom that he claims he does not have, he transforms his way of being in such a way that he already becomes similar to a wise person. And then it's not without reason that the later schools are not going to consider Socrates only a philosopher. They are going to take him as the paradigm of a wise person. So there's an interesting paradox here as well, but that points out precisely, on the other hand, to this idea that to philosophize, even if you are not wise, even if wisdom itself is not entirely achievable, in a way, you're already participating somehow of that state by the mere fact that you are looking for it. And in that context, Hadot explicitly quotes Plotinus, like, you wouldn't seek me if you did not already find me, if you had not already found me. So this is, and here comes this very idea of knowledge has participation. Knowledge has participating in that which you know. I think this plays a very pivotal role here, to that the sort of philosophical knowledge is knowledge by participation, by participating, even if not completely, but to some extent in the being of that which you want to know. So this raises interesting paradoxes, particularly in the case of Socrates, which is fascinating because it's that thing. Socrates says, "Oh, I'm not wise, I don't know," but then he behaves like the wise person himself. Nothing takes him astray. He's always coherent to his own self, to his own being. And that is the very definition of perfection in this Greek context. The being who is perfect is completely coherent to itself. It's not affected by anything external to it. So this is an interesting paradox to explore there as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I see that Gianfranco also wants to make a question or commentary.
Yes, thank you very much, Lucas, for this very, very interesting conference. Well, I'm just like to focusing on well, the core topic, of your title. That is, well, you of course you expressed, I think, very, very well also the references that all the references you made clarify, what is your main intention. Well, but well, I thought that your title remained a bit aside, of your conference. Well, and that is a topic I wanted to focus on. That is this life beyond capitalism. Of course, you clarified how Foucault's and Byung-Chul Han's critics of neoliberalism can be defined as an alternative, a possibility of alternative, to I mean, to contemporary capitalism. And this book, I think, you mentioned, Vita Contemplativa by Byung-Chul Han, and of course another one of the more known of him, that is Society of Tiredness, make clear how Byung-Chul Han has a perspective of overcrossing, what are the lines or the main difficulties we live as a subjects entirely subjected to modern economic way of life. Well, my question is focused precisely on this. Is on your opinion, on your intention too, the idea of philosophy as a way of life, as we have, according to Foucault, to Hadot, and Byung-Chul Han also in this case. And if in your opinion, philosophy of a way of life can be defined as a radically alternative to capitalism. So as a form of living that cannot be compromised with neoliberalistic forms of life. And that is the first and the more simple question. The second one, if I can put also, concerns the fact that a philosophical life, because in antiquity, was, as we know, something absolutely elitary, something that could be lived, by a little part of the society. At our time, our fight, if you can say, is that philosophy as a way of life would be a form of life democratically open, to everyone, to everybody. Mm-hmm. And that is my question, because if we also imagine, this possibility of opening, a form of life radically alternative to our economic way of life, or to our economic form of governance, of government, according to Foucault. Also, we can imagine that philosophy as political, very political and also economic intention and possibility that aims basically transformation, just not of the individual form of life, but of an entire society or entirely global form of life and of worldview.
Thank you so much, Gianfranco. I think your questions are really important. And again, I'm really sorry for actually not delivering what was at first promised. Like I said, I was disappointed not to be able to participate on the Congress in July, and I really wanted to present this meta perspective on PWL. So, this ends up being the reason why the actual topic of the title was cast a little bit into the foreground, into the background, but I think this is also a great opportunity to elaborate further on it. So, yes, first of all, in terms of whether philosophy as a way of life could be proposed as a radical alternative to the sort of capitalistic way of life we live today, so to speak, in late capitalism, neoliberalism, so on, I believe this is I in fact believe that this is a perspective that can be defended. But and in a way, whether people are not aware of it, whether people are aware of that or not, this discussion is already being made in terms that recover many of the aspects that we connect with philosophy as a way of life. This is actually one of the reasons why I mentioned this Brazilian indigenous philosopher, which is Ailton Krenak, because in many ways, the kind of propositions he brings in terms of how to think another way of life, a life that in which we are not submitted to the demands of productivity and to the demands of, work and so on, and economic growth. The alternative presented to that then, by means of of looking into the way those indigenous traditions live, are actually very close to what Hadot describes as the philosophical way of life. In those terms of, to use Byung-Chul Han, of a vita contemplativa, right? Of a contemplative life that is a sort of counter model because it's not focused on productivity. One could say that in this perspective, if we take also what Han says about that, not only Han, but Krenak himself says that explicitly in different points. He claims that, look, to be concerned with being productive is already not living in the moment, because you're not thinking about what you're experiencing right now. You're thinking about what you're going to get next. So the more we lead our lives focusing entirely on working, the more we live unfulfilling lives because we are never fully enjoying the present moment, and we are always, throwing to the future the moment in which we will ultimately be able to feel fulfilled. And this is precisely the sort of dynamics that Han points out in his books, like Burnout Society. The entrepreneur of the self believes that he has to work in order to affirm himself, to be free, but in doing that, he does not feel fulfilled. Actually, the result is the exhaustion that leads to burnout, depression, and so on, because nothing will ever be enough. So I think, in a sense here, what is proposed, one perspective that is connected to this way of looking at philosophy as a way of life is this idea of a way of life that is not focused on productivity, and in a way is even centered in a certain idea of improductivity, not in the sense of pure passivity or of literally doing nothing, but of doing things that are an end into themselves and that allow us to live entirely in the moment, to truly feel realized in the moment. So I think there is a lot to be explored there, but I think one really relevant point is precisely the discussion around cosmic consciousness, because that is the issue that Han points out in Foucault's work when he says, look, when you take from this ancient philosophy practice of way of life away the dimension of cosmic consciousness, then you transform this way of life in something that can be easily reduced to this entrepreneur of the self way of living, because then the focus is on how we change ourselves as individuals, how we cultivate our individuality, rather than on how we cultivate a collective way of being. And I think this perspective of a collective way of being is also present in Hadot's description of philosophy as a way of life, because he puts this emphasis on the schools. He says himself, philosophy is first of all, in the introduction to what is ancient philosophy. So philosophy is first of all a way of life, but a way of life that can never be practiced alone. You always practice it in a community, within a school, within the context of a school, within the context of a larger community. So I think in many ways, this points to us interesting indications of a radical alternative to the way we live today. Of course, in order to explore this deeper, we would have to use another opportunity, but I do think that it points something relevant as an alternative. But regarding your second question, whether or not this approach of philosophy as a way of life could be elitistic, so to say, I think that's a very important discussion to be made. I don't want to dwell here too long on this answer, but my short answer to that would be, but you see, thinking about philosophy as a way of life in a way is also what allows us to remove a certain elitistic aspect, because Hadot reminds us, from the ancient philosopher point of view, philosopher is not necessarily someone who develops a system, a sophisticated system of thought, and uses that to live a certain way. But rather, if you have a politic who lives stoically, then he's already a philosopher. he doesn't have to have an original discourse on philosophy to be a philosopher. He just needs to live philosophically. And sure, you can say, okay, but certain forms of life are not really within reach of everyone, and that would also be true. But I think it's also interesting to say that the kinds of philosophical life that Hadot presents to us allows us to go beyond a practice of philosophical way of life that would only be limited to a very few number of people. Because if you can think of cynicism, for instance, you can also think of indigenous traditions. You can think of many ways through which practicing this philosophical way of life in a way, in the sense of aiming for reaching that state of peace of mind, doesn't require any sort of sophisticated elitistic perspective or cultivation that couldn't be reached by everyone in that sense. Because again, and to be honest, if I'm going to be very honest, very frequently I have met and talked to people who had no education in philosophy whatsoever, but that I thought that in those terms were much more of philosophers than many of us are, in terms of the way they deal with life, aiming for this state of tranquility, for having a certain wisdom as knowing how to live. So, of course, again, this is really worth a bigger discussion, but I do believe it's possible to think of various ways of practicing this philosophical way of life, the search for wisdom as peace of mind, has been fully in the present moment, and has experiencing this connection to something bigger than myself that don't have to be elitistic at all. But thank you so much, Gianfranco, for your question.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we are running out of time. We still have 2 questions from the audience and a few comments in the chat. Before I give the word to Georgie and Jean-Luc, I will probably just quickly read the comments in the chat. There is one question by Eric Figueroa. The use of words like peace of mind, serenity, plenitude, how different are they to the use of other discourses such as mindfulness coaching or New Age therapies? I would actually add religion. I won't have time to make you my questions. I hope we can discuss later. But one of the things that was on my mind was that if you define wisdom as a kind of know-how that is attained through the practice of spiritual exercises, and where discourse is not really relevant, it will be really difficult to distinguish philosophy from religious practices, I believe. Or I would like to know how you would distinguish philosophy from religion from this point of view. But let me go on. And there is another question by Nikki Clemens. Or comment, actually. Really interesting account of affability, Freundlichkeit, in hand as a community or collective orientation. Would you describe this as a middle level of self-formation between Hadot's cosmic consciousness, universally focused, and Foucault's care of the self, individually focused? I would find Han's Freundlichkeit helpful for articulating such a middle way in Foucault, since I disagree with the individualistic reading of Foucault, because particularly between 82 and 84, I think he's engaging in more of a collective orientation towards critiquing social political conditions. In his lectures on Parisia and in chapter drafts, he wrote on a standalone book on arts of living called Gouvernement de Soi et des Autres, agree the conditions for social critique and challenge that Gianfranco is describing is key. Sorry, Nikki, if I didn't reproduce it correctly. I'm trying to read it quickly. And then finally, Paulo Verusa, perhaps the capitalistic way of life lacks the empathical understanding of everyone's socio-economical reality. In that sense, going philosophically beyond descriptive function of language is important to feel and live reality as one's own, as the other's reality, and as the shared reality. Lucas, I sometimes in this kind of discussion, the questions are more important than the answers. I just wanted to bring these points to discussion. So if you want to comment them, just be quick, please. We still have 2 questions.
Of course.
In 2 minutes.
I'll try to be very quick. about, first of all, about distinguishing this kind of peace of mind from this new age sort of mentality, so to speak. I think the dimension of cosmic consciousness is very important to draw this distinction, because the paradox of those modern new age practices, so to say, is that they precisely tend to focus on this, still on this individual self-cultivation again. So you do mindfulness, but you are also an entrepreneur that work, like exploiting people, but that's okay, because all that is important is to cultivate your own peace of mind. And I think that in Hadotian terms, one could say that to cultivate peace of mind is necessary to cultivate this collective perspective, this awareness of your connection to the whole. True peace of mind is inseparable from that. So there's also, one could say, there's a whole tradition in Buddhism linked to compassion that would be very illuminating on that topic. As for the question of religion, Marta, in a sense, I don't think that we have to have that we need a clearly drawn distinction between religion and philosophy. In that sense, I don't find that problematic. Although it's important to say, I did not mean at all. I don't mean at all that philosophical discourse is not relevant to reaching this know-how. Quite on the contrary, I think it's one of the most important tools. But as it turns out, this is also true of those religious traditions, which are also philosophical traditions in India, for instance, in Buddhism, in Advaita Vedanta. In those traditions, rational analysis is fundamental to reach that state of peace of mind, to reach that wisdom. It's a fundamental tool to get there. So and at the same time, one could argue that maybe one way to make a relevant distinction is that not all religion is spiritual in that sense, in the sense of trying to cultivating this cosmic consciousness, this kind of peace of mind. Not all religion, I would say, is aimed at that. So one could make also this point that spirituality is not identical to religion. Also in and in fact, if we believe in Hadot, Christianism itself absorbed spiritual exercises into their tradition as a later movement, not as something that was constitutive of Christian religion itself. So this might be an important separation to be drawn here. And about Nikki, I thank you so much for your comment. I think I agree with you in nearly everything you said. I do know, and people have pointed out to me on more than one occasion that Foucault also proposes this more collective take. But one suspicion that I have is I don't think that Foucault separates care of the self from care of the others. However, the point that might still draw a critique from the Hadotian or perspective, or from the perspective of Byung-Chul Han, is that this care is again still thought in terms of cultivating the individual existence. Even if I'm cultivating it with others, I'm still cultivating it in terms of how I enrich what I am as an individual, rather than cultivating this cosmic consciousness. Maybe the question would be whether even if there's care for the others, there's not necessarily cosmic consciousness. So this is a point that could be drawn here. But yeah, I think that's it. Well, it was a little bit more than 2 minutes. Sorry for that, Marta. Your audio is off. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you. Georgie also wants to make a question. I need to ask you to be very quick, please.
Maybe I was just going to say, maybe George and Gianluca can make their questions together,
and then you reply. Yeah.
Okay, that works for me. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Thank you for organizing this event. Well, my question concerns, in a way, the fact, what they call a fact-value distinction, right? Because I think when we talk about discourse and its inseparability from the way we live our life ethically, right, then the fact-value distinction sort of crumbles. And a lot of science, or maybe I guess a false conception of science, is built up on a rigid sort of fact-value distinction, right? And so that's why when you mentioned Wittgenstein, that really caught my ear, because I think what a brilliant thing that he does in the Tractatus is that to pretend that he's making a rigid fact-value distinction, and then he says, no, that's actually nonsense. And then he again emphasizes what I think you emphasized a lot in your presentation, is that there's something that points beyond discourse. And not only is it there, but it's more than non-trivial, it's the most important part, right? And so this is becoming a big question. I'm sorry about this, but I guess I'm turning towards a biopolitical sort of, making a biopolitical question here, because how does neoliberalism maybe monopolize on our illusion that the fact-value distinction needs to be there for there to be science?
Yeah.
Hi, now it's my turn, right? Can you hear me well?
Yeah. Yes.
So I was going to introduce the question, but I'm going straight to her. Are we not running the risk here with this passivity? I know you don't think this is a passivity. I see some contradiction in the emphasis on the now and practical life, and the practical decision. Well, because you say it's put more relevance on the ends, the action that aims to the ends, and not on means. But let's go to the question. Are we not running the risk here with this passivity of the contemplative life, of allowing the chains, and this chain goes in quotes, of course, the chains of capitalism to multiply and strengthen, because we are in this balance with the, let's call the system, to simplify, and therefore we are, I think, in a danger of calling this not life behind capitalism, but like under capitalism, because we still allow capitalism to operate with this way of life. Let's say. I'm sorry if my English isn't the best.
No, but I think I understand your question, in the sense, in what way, by putting the emphasis too much on the way of life, are we not just conforming to the way we already live and not allowing for philosophical critique or analysis, if I understood it correctly? Yeah. Okay, good. So to say very briefly, Georgie, I agree with you that maybe put in those terms, this fact-value distinction is one of the core things that is put into question here, because what is put into question is precisely what became, so to speak, our traditional notion of knowledge, in which knowledge is only discursive, and so it's entirely separate from what we use, from what we are, from what we experience as such. And I think this would be a very long discussion. We really have to continue this conversation at another opportunity. But to be very brief, I think is this separation that allows the knowledge to be seen as a product and to be completely inserted within this logic of production from capitalism, in which we are in academia today. Because knowledge is now not about changing yourself, it's about producing something, producing a discourse that then can circulate and move in genes and so on. So I definitely agree with you there. And I think PWL allows us to understand that Wittgenstein wasn't joking when he said, the most important part of my book isn't what I said, but what I didn't say. And it's literally that. It's really, you can see by that perspective.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't know. Yeah. And Gianluca, to be clear then about what I was saying, I think there's a relevant point to be made, but I want to be absolutely clear that to say that the emphasis is on the way of life is by no means at all to say that the emphasis is on adopting critically a certain way of life. Quite on the contrary, it's a way of life that is fundamentally critical. Again, take the example of Socrates. His way of life cannot be translated into any specific discourse. His philosophy cannot be described within any, it's not, his philosophy isn't a description of something. And at the same time, it's essentially critical. It's questioning, interrogating people about what they think they know in order to show them that they don't know what they know. So saying that philosophy is a way of life is not saying that we have to conform to the ways we already live. Quite on the contrary, Hadot is even very emphatical in the sense that the philosophical way of life is always seen as a way of life that leads us away from the way that people usually live, from the way that people usually live in society, that makes us question that. I think maybe to conclude, I would say this is a very important point to be made, that to put the emphasis on the way of life is not to discard rationality, to discard critical thinking or attitude. Quite on the contrary, is to understand that this knowledge and this critical attitude is not merely discursive, it's something that we have to practice in other ways, it's something that we have to cultivate in our consciousness beyond mere discourse, beyond merely saying things. So this is, I would say, this would be a way of answering it. It's not a way of accepting critically anything, but rather to be really critical of the things that we receive from tradition, from society, and so on, and being critical in a way that goes beyond merely talking about stuff, requires you to understand things, to cultivate this consciousness on a different level. So yeah, that would be the gist of it, I would say.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lucas, for this terrific talk, and thanks everyone for the interesting discussion. I now need to close the session. I believe we could keep discussing for another hour or more, but it's good to have a limit as well. Yes, Lucas?
I think Pablo was actually the first one to make a question above there, Pablo Lerusa. I guess maybe I could talk to you later, Paulo, Paulo Verusa, actually, if you could send me the question by email. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Well,
thanks, everyone.
Yeah, Paulo even wrote me out. Sorry, Paulo, I just saw it now. He was asking you to answer this question. I will just read the question, but I think we won't have time for the reply. Just leave it as a comment. So I was going to, this is a question by Paulo Verhus. Lucas, I was going to ask about that being behind the doing good, but fortunately it came to that in your own current of thought. This was already in the beginning, I think. Please elaborate on why perfection in the way of being is seen as a controversial topic, as you said. And I think we have to leave this for another opportunity. If you don't mind, you can always discuss.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I just have this impression. I might be wrong, but we can discuss this later. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again for the interesting discussion. As I previously mentioned, this was the last session of the seminar this academic year. We will come back in September, and you can already check the calendar of the seminar in the next academic year on our website. I will leave the link here in the chat so that you can check it. And I also leave you the link for our conference, because before we go on holidays, there will still be a conference in Lisbon dedicated to a metaphilosophical discussion of the very notion of philosophy as a way of life. Lucas has already mentioned it, and I think has already given an important contribution for this discussion. The title of the conference is What Exactly is Philosophy as a Way of Life? Boundaries, Crossroads, Deadlocks. It will take place on the 5th and 6th of July, and it will count with the participation of many members of the project. It will be held in Lisbon, but online attendance will also be possible. We will transmit it via Zoom. And you can check all the information in the link I've just left you in the chat. And I will send you then later the link closer to the event. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope to see you all then, either virtually or in person. So till then, take care, and yeah, see you soon. Thank you for being there. See you next time.
See you soon, everyone. Thank you so much for everything, the questions, the discussion. It was great.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.